The following is an official lore video of the Dark Diaspora Universe, a journey in world-building project.
Ninja hated farming. It was all robotics, automation, genetic engineering, micronutrient dispenses, and interstellar market speculation. Boring. You needed like 6 degrees just to be a farmhand on Harlos. No thank you. She longed for the simple life. A life of towering buildings, extensive shopping malls, plays, art, and people. Oh, how she longed for people. Growing up on one of the hundreds of thousands of homesteads dotted across Harlos, she had spent her life with her family and a collection of farmhands. Her family were nice and all, no traumatic upbringing stories of which to speak. But after 18 years of pretty much only her father, mother, and younger brother, she needed a break. Time to find herself, to explore the planet and maybe the wider diaspora. An autonomous vehicle rolled down the gravel road towards the farmhouse. The silver vehicle had an odd cross-section, a tall modular-style A-frame design with comparatively small compact wheels. Ninja picked up her duffel bag from the ground beside her and slung it over her shoulder, flicking her long purple hair out of the way of the strap. She hugged her parents tearfully, and even her brother returned her embrace, begrudgingly at first, but then it lingered longer than she expected. She smiled. She would miss him too, even if it would go unspoken. Then, with a wordless goodbye and a final wave, she stepped into the car and slowly drove away. The car followed the gravel road of the farmstead, the 3 miles to the outer gate, and crossed the threshold into the vast open expanses of the fields. The angular vehicle continued its journey along crude but functional tarmac roads, before turning to run in parallel to a set of 12 parallel rail tracks. As the car trundled forward of its own accord, Nedra peered out the window. Her mind was lost in the reverie of what was being left behind and in contemplation over the potential opportunities that awaited her. As she did, her eyes scanned across the endless fields arrayed before her, the vast canvas of the world painted in a swath of yellows, browns, and tans. Dominating over 90% of the planet, tall stalks of perfectly planted fields of engineered cereal crops swayed in the gentle breeze, optimally watered by rain clouds induced by the networking of orbitable climate-controlled satellites. The fields were so expansive that the planet itself had a golden tinge from orbit, a fact reflected in the planet's emblematic flag. An exorbitantly expensive yet perfectly terraformed world, Harlos had long been critical to the compact's internal security, ensuring no person went hungry. Of course, for Nedra and the other residents of the planet, hunger was what happened when you waited too long for second breakfast. She understood concepts of famine, of course, but they were just that. Concepts. The car slowed and Nedra's windscreen HUD indicated that the vehicle was shifting to AG-Lev mode. As it crossed onto the tracks, the tires retracted and several small micro-AG dispensers held the car aloft, while a central electromagnet anchored the car in place above the track. And then, it began to accelerate. Gone was the slow, meandering pace on the rudimentary roads, replaced by unnatural speed. Ninja felt her body pushed back into the comfortable and supportive seat as the worst of the G-forces were buffered by the car's AG field. Within moments, the car reached 150 miles per hour, yet it was not done. A second warning alarm blinked to alert Ninja to the upcoming merger. She brought up the live orbital feed and could see that several miles behind her on a parallel track was a high-speed levitating train, comprised of well over 400 individual cars shaped just like Ninja's. Her car continued to accelerate, exceeding 200 miles per hour, then 250. It was, however, far slower than the oncoming train, which itself was beginning to pull back from near 80% of the speed of sound, seemingly to match her sudden arrival. As the train approached, Nindra noted on her HUD that a split had formed in the middle of the train, dividing into fore and aft sections. Within moments, the first part of the train bulleted past her car on the adjacent track. Nindra's car accelerated once again and, within moments, had reached over 300 miles an hour just in time to merge with the now split train, veering to the left and sliding into the midst of the break. Nindra felt only a minor jostling as her car physically merged with the forward and rear parts of the train, as if a heart of a great serpent. One moment, the car was a separate vehicle, and now it was part of a greater whole and was already accelerating rapidly back to top speed. Nindra placed her hands on her lap as the internal seats of her car began to automatically reorient, configuring themselves into a window-facing lounge with a small desk and screen, leaving the other side of the car to serve as a corridor. And as soon as the forward and rear walls of the car retracted, Nindra's previous solitude was broken by a dozen or so people suddenly walking through her car on their way to the communal carriages that anchored the train. Her fellow passengers were all waves and smiles as they passed by, as was the custom when passing through a newly merged autocar. Nindra didn't mind. It wasn't her first time on a train, but it was far from a common occurrence for her to be around so many people she didn't know. She glanced up and down the length of the train from her seat and could see hundreds of other passengers, chatting, working, or simply lost in the view. For a moment, a wave of social anxiety swept across her, but she let it roll over her mind and body, embracing the communal nature of the setting to help acclimatize her for the adventure ahead. This was what she wanted, she reminded herself. People, adventure, excitement. As she looked down the open corridor, Nindra noticed several people gesturing out the window. She turned and across the endless fields, she caught the first glimpse of towering spires of glass and iron and crystal of the city of Bern, regional capital and her destination. The city spires glinted in the bright mid-morning sun. It was as if the reflected light was the beacon calling her forward, calling her home. She smiled to herself, excitement replacing the anxiety of moments before. She had no doubt. Adventure awaited her. Commander Dolam stood at ease at the observation display on the command deck of Rom Station. He stood, sipping a steaming cup of coffee as he surveyed the world before him. Here, in high orbit about Harlos, he marveled at man's creation, a near-perfect world that was a larder and breadbasket that sustained 100 million souls across the diaspora. He could see the glinting of the urban centers of glass and metal that towered over the gentle cream and tan beige hues of the landscape. It was a miracle made manifest by the ingenuity of humanity, and he was proud to play his critical part in realizing the bounty of the world. As he admired the planet, his gaze caught a subtle flare of green energy ripple across his view, a glimpse of an energized field that permeated lower orbit. That was the effects of the geo-constellation satellites, and within minutes, the anchoring station of the constellation, Ubervaken Station, came into view. Slightly smaller than his own pod-launch manifold station, Ubervaken was far more technologically advanced. It was characterized by the torrid shape that was common among orbit stations. However, unlike other major orbit facilities across the diaspora, the station was surrounded by a vast array of energized filled panels and dishes, giving the station the appearance of a garden of stunning iridescent flowers perpetually in bloom. Dolam imagined his compatriot, Commander Trina, was also at that moment enjoying his morning coffee, gazing up at Rom's station with similar feelings of pride. Dolam silently toasted his brother-at-arms, a small gesture of solidarity between commanders, even if the other would never know. Dolam's reverie was broken by the approach of his exo, a bright and talented young woman called Serafina. She was only 10 years younger than Dolem's 55, but she wore her age much better than he did. Her shoulder-length brown hair framing the smooth olive skin of her face and draping down to brush against the shoulders of her crisp command uniform, adorned with commendation pins. "Commander," Serafina said, assuming a position by Dolem's side to join him in the view. They both stood for a few extra moments, absorbing the view before the blaring of alarms and warnings heaved the burden of command upon them both once again. Dolem looked at Serafina and rolled his eyes. "Let's see what this is about then," he declared nonchalantly, and the two of them began to meander towards the increasingly frantic command deck. As the door slid open, a seemingly sourceless voice from the far side of the room's expansive command deck heralded their arrival. "Commander on deck!" All assembled, some 30 personnel, stood briefly to acknowledge Dolem and Serafina's presence before they returned their focus to the screens before them. "Status," Dolem said, walking to the center of the deck to take a seat, directing his query to the new sensors operative on the console to his left. "Raiders, sir," the operative responded, before assuming control of the primary display and projecting a live feed of the incoming threat. Within moments, they saw the raiders in all their glory, or lack thereof. Assembled was a collection of what looked like 6 commandeered autonomous transport pods, haphazardly retrofitted from their disjointed and chaotic appearance. The operative continued. "Telemetry has them jumping in from the Anira zone, likely beyond Pyron." Dolem sighed and rubbed his face in resigned frustration. "Where are they heading?" The leeward deposit, sir." Dolem turned to his exo with an almost bored expression on his face. Raiders, particularly from impoverished settlements in the Anira zone, or beyond the Cernius Passage near Merzadon, were an infrequent annoyance. Dolem knew starvation, deprivation, and desperation was rampant across the Diaspora, particularly in the more inhospitable worlds and moons of the vast expanses. But few ever grew desperate enough to raid and pillage the grain storage depots in high orbit of Harlos. He would never understand why, even when faced with the misery of existence, why anyone would ever take the risk, knowing that the outcome was all but certain. "Operative, please tag and issue orders to the Coalition Patrol to engage with extreme prejudice," Dolem declared, his subdued monotone conveying none of the gravity of his order. "Sir, several of the vessels are claiming by refugees, saying they have women and children on board," the operative stated, turning to the commander. The audio now playing openly across the bridge. "I can hear a lot of commotion in the transmission, multiple voices crying and screaming. Do I relay the order to the patrol?" "No," Dolem responded, frustrated at the operative's presumption. "It's a common ruse, and even if it's true, the responsibility for the souls aboard on those ships rests with their reckless captains. Board policy is clear. There is no mercy for those that threaten the breadbasket of the Diaspora." The display before the command deck showed 3 sleek-looking silver and blue vessels, Coalition mercenaries that were contracted for anti-piracy patrols, making directly for the approaching pirates. Within moments, the vast distances of space were closed, and soon several hull-mounted railguns opened fire on the comparatively slow and bulbous pods. Flashes of red and white light signaled the strike of the hyper-accelerated projectiles before the retrofitted pods of the raiders, one by one, began to explode. The frantic audio of the raiders' desperate pleas that had echoed across the commander's deck quickly abated as, one by one, the cacophony of desperate screams were utterly extinguished. It was less than 2 minutes since the arrival of the raiders, and all that was left of them was the broken hulls of their ill-fated scatterpods, slowly tumbling down towards the thick atmosphere of Harlos. As a moment of silence gripped the commander's deck before the comms operative finally spoke, sensors confirmed 122 souls on board, including 41 children. The operative looked over at the command, their expression breaking slightly at the reality of what had just transpired. Dolem looked over at his exo, with Serafina nodding back to him, reassuring him of the justice of his decision. Collateral damage. Jeremy's head rung from the impact. like a tolling bell vibrating incessantly in his mind. His hand instinctually grasped at the back of his skull, his short brown hair damp from blood, confirming the sharp stabbing pain in his head. He groaned, blinking his eyes to focus them, as a thumping, aching pain permeated every inch of his body. He could see very little, the light of the surface above him but a distant point from this depth. He had to be at least 100 feet down, he thought to himself, as the immediate shock began to fade and the circumstances of fall returned to his mind. For only moments ago, he had been on the surface, out-calibrating the terrestrial sensor station positioned in one of the distant fields that formed part of the Noel farmstead outside of New Dresden. It was early in the day, around 9 a.m. when he was going about his routine diagnostics, when the ground below him began to shake violently and audibly crack. And without warning, he felt himself begin to fall. Jeremy was fortunate. His fall had quickly turned into a tumble and slide as he crashed into a sloped stony chasm that buffered him from the worst of the impact. A straight fall into the subterranean lair probably would have killed him. Yet from the throbbing pain that ached in his bones and muscles, he confirmed to himself that he was very much alive. Jeremy slowly got to his feet, checking his body as he did. There were plenty of cuts and some contusions severe enough to instantly bruise. And there were the blood on his head, his hair already matting from the sticky coagulation. All things considered, it was a miracle he was in one piece. His eyes, still blurry, began to adjust to the dark as confusion filled his mind. Tunnels. A vast network of tunnel entrances were arrayed around him, deep, dark openings that contrasted with the subtle illumination of the chasm open above him. There shouldn't have been anything like this, Jeremy thought to himself. The board's geological reports had always confirmed nothing but near-perfect tectonic stability and subsurface integrity. I will have to report this, he said to himself as he looked up at the distant sunlight above him and slowly made his way over to the pile of broken shards of rock and aggregate that he had brought down with him. He began to make his way back up the sloping chasm wall that had buttressed his descent, but the incline was too steep. There was no use. There was no way out. He turned and reached down to his belt, fumbling at his small torch before retrieving it and switching it on. The beam of light immediately illuminated the cavern around his, revealing a vast open space, some 50 feet in diameter and 100 feet in height. He shone the beam of light out in front of his towards the tunnel, surveying his surrounds in hope of finding a way out. Eyes. He saw them for only a moment, a brief flash of illuminated silver and white eyes in one of the tunnels before him. It was almost too quick, his mind dismissing the possibility almost as soon as the shock of the flash had appeared. His adrenaline, that had begun to crash after the alarm of his drop, spiked once again. But this was different. This was a fight or flight response, and he could feel his body tense instinctually. The torch beam lingered for a moment, fixed at where he swore he had seen the pair of eyes. His haggard breath was thunderous in his ears, yet he was startled again, this time hearing a sound to his left. He spun around, moving the light in time to see something move. He couldn't make it out exactly, but it almost looked like a leg, as it was pulled back behind the lip of the tunnel. Yet the suddenness of the movement was enough for the fear welling in Jeremy to take hold of him. In his terror-filled desperation, he called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice echoed through the cavern and through the myriad of tunnel entrances. For a long pause, there was no response, and soon Jeremy's mind began to reassure him that it was all in his head. And then he heard it. A gravelly voice, almost imperceptible to the ears, filled with harsh whispered tones, responded from right behind him. "We are here." Jeremy spun again, this time leaping back as the light of his torch illuminated the source of the voice. At first, he thought it was a person. Maybe someone was nearby and had come to rescue him, he began to tell himself. But then his mind began to process the details of the figure before him. It was tall, unnaturally so, approaching 8 feet in height. It was thin and wiry, lithe in a sickly way. Its skin was gray as stone and adorned haphazardly with all manner of jagged ridges and protrusions jutting from across its otherwise naked torso of bone and sinewy fibrous muscle. The creature's face that filled Jeremy with the utmost terror. There were large eyes, pupilless and black, barred for the light reflected from his torch. Its nose was also missing, replaced by a mangled sinus hole. Yet its mouth triggered a primal response from Jeremy. The creature opened its large maw to reveal its razor-sharp teeth, rows of fangs like a shark from Lost Earth. It was a sight of abject horror, and then, without warning, the creature attacked. Jeremy, unable to flee, struggled against his attacker's grasp. But despite the creature's appearance, it easily overpowered him, pushing him to the ground once more before picking up one of Jeremy's legs and dragging him away. Jeremy clawed at the ground as he was dragged, desperate for a handhold that would serve as his salvation, or at least a delay to the seemingly inevitability of his demise. But he found none on the smooth stony floor of the cavern. Moments later, the cavern was empty of all but the sound of Jeremy's screams of pain and terror echoing from one of the innumerous tunnels. But even the torturous sounds of Jeremy's horror began to fade away into the distance. As the last hints of Jeremy's horror-filled screams finally dissipated into the thick air, the cavern fell once more into silence, leaving little trace of Jeremy. His fate unknown, never again to be seen.
Before the dreaming and our fall from the stars, we were the servants of a god. The great serpent, Uruka, whose vast and endless body carved through the heavens and birthed the stars themselves, was our master, and we served him faithfully. So perfect was our devoted servitude that the serpent grew stronger and stronger in our care, and soon life was ushered into the universe as part of his grand design. As the first and most noble of his servants, our hearts were filled with pride in the role we played in the burgeoning of life through the heavens. Yet despite our status in the eyes of our god, our hearts soon became tainted with jealousy. For Uruka loved the life he had created and bestowed upon it all his attention and favor. And that is when our pride turned to arrogance and conceit. We viewed ourselves better than this new life, older and wiser and more deserving of favor, and it was through this vanity that the seeds of our fall were sown. The corruption of our pride was made manifest in the great betrayal. During one of the serpent's many slumbers, we reveled in the absence of his divine authority and imposed our own will on his many creations, ruling over them as if gods ourselves. But we lacked the love and empathy of Uruka, and soon, our rule turned to tyranny, fear, and terror. When the serpent awoke and witnessed how we, his firstborn, had been corrupted by power and had imposed our tyranny on his creations, his punishment was swift and absolute. We were banished from the stars, falling through the air and fire onto a nameless world filled of great beasts and undulating landscapes. We were stripped of our might and our spark, and left to survive only with our cunning and wits. Yet Uruka's punishment was not complete. With a flick of his great tongue, he breathed life into the very earth of the world, and soon great swaths of the land stood tall upon vast legs of stone and rock, began to traverse and feed upon the surface, our new home, with great devastation. Many of our kind perished in the initial waves of destruction, as we were laid low by Uruka's creation of vengeance, which he called his giants. Yet, some of us learned to adapt and survive, and we, the Hooma, descendants of the fallen servants of Uruka, lived on. Yet we continue to bear the stain of the sins of our ancestors, for we must always remain on the move, never to settle, never to build or put down roots. We wander across the world of Ovfar, nomadic tribes on beastback, seeking to stay ahead of the inevitable calamity of an awakened giant. Or to stop, to stay, to pause for more than a moment, is to beckon forth one's death. Yet, in our sleep, we can claim back for ourselves the briefest of respite. We can still find moments, rest, and peace. Here, we enter the dreaming, the ethereal world of the spirit, where all can escape to their past or to fantastical worlds of imagination. Yet, even in the dreaming, we were never truly safe, for the specter of the giants, their vast alien incomparable minds, ever loom over us, watching, waiting, and, to the most gifted of dreamers, speaking.
Ancient lore tells us that the giants of Ovfar are the enemy on the Hooma, that when Uruka breathed life into the giants, beckoning them forth from the ground with his divine essence, he also imbued into them a vicious enmity for the Hooma that fueled their eternal hatred of Uruka's once favored servants. And, for an age, the seemingly apocalyptic violence and unending destruction of the giants proved true this tale. For whenever we Hooma put down roots and sought to build the foundations of a civilization, to set ourselves on the path to once again return to the stars and to our God, the giants would come and lay waste to our progress. Whenever we farmed, whenever we would settle, the giants would appear and they would destroy and lay claim to the very land and soil and mineral bounty of the world that we had long hoped to leverage into prosperity. Yet there was some who believed we Hooma did not understand Uruka's teachings, his lesson given form by the creation of the giants, that the giants were not inherently evil and instead simply existed on a scale that dwarfed our own. The first to proselytize this belief was a young woman called Natalia of the Wandering Tribes, who history teaches was the first of the Dreamweavers. One night at camp, after imbibing on the tilly root and the nash leaf, Natalia fell into a deep trance and her mind reached out into the vast world of the dreamscape. Here, her mind's eye wandered the ether just as her body wandered the land. Yet she did not search for her past, for ancestors of old. Instead, she yearned to connect with the ever-present minds of the giants that dwelled there. And when she finally made the connection, when the fringes of her mind brushed against the enormity of the consciousness, she did not sense the hatred and the burning desire for destruction that she had expected from the enemy of the Hooma. Instead, she sensed something very alien, minds so incomparably different to her own that they existed in the dreamscape and in the waking realm at the same time, as if a bridge between the two worlds. The giants were proved intelligent, albeit seemingly existing on a different flow of time, appearing slow and ponderous to us. So alien was their minds that communication and conversation was impossible. Yet Natalia was successful in conveying and understanding broad emotions and concepts to the giants. Many of us know and accept that the giants are not our enemies, that Uruka did not bring them forth into the world of Ovfar to be a never-ending source of punishment, death, and torture. They are a test, a reality of our existence designed to eternally destabilize us to prevent us from rebuilding and returning to the stars till we are ready to learn one fundamental lesson: that we are small. that we are but a small part of the greater whole of existence, and rather than yearn to rise above others and impose our tyranny, we must seek to live in harmony as part of the world and universe. And only when each of us, in our very souls, truly understands this truth, then we will again be worthy of the stars.
Narada awoke in a panic, her gown drenched in sweat from the mental and physical ordeal of the dream. She was a dream weaver, and so for her, the dreamscape was far from a sedate ethereal realm of escapism and memory. It was a battering test of endurance, as she attempted to comprehend the plotting and rambling musings of the alien minds of the giants. She set up with a start from her sleeping mat, her attendant shocked by her sudden awakening. She was expecting Narada to remain in her drug-induced trance for several more hours. Narada immediately held her hand to her face, rubbing her temples and eyes as the lingering effects off the roots and leaves she had imbibed caused her head to ache. Of course, communing with the incomparable minds of the giants didn't help either, but she had no time for self-indulgence. Turning to her attendant, a young woman with a startled expression on her face. "We have to go," Narada declared with a panicked tone, her attendant seemingly confused by her statement. "Now," the Dreamweaver declared. "The caravan must flee or we must all die." The attendant nodded with a small head bow before turning to run from the yurt, leaving the flap to whip back and forth in the wind. Narada, feeling the sudden coolness of the air against her glistening skin, roused herself to her feet. Even before she had taken a step, the deep bellow of a thunderous horn blared from the outside. She stood up straight, patted down her gown, and left the yurt. As she stepped beyond the threshold, a flash of lightning arced across the sky, startling Narada. She hadn't known there was a storm. That would complicate the escape, she thought. She stood there for a moment and watched the flurry of activity spread through the encampment like a wave. News was spreading and each yurt was showing signs of activity. "How long do we have?" a deep voice declared, a figure approaching from Narada's left. Out of the task strode a tall man in the lead of a small group. The man's skin was tanned and weathered, his green eyes catching the flickering illumination of a nearby brazier. "An hour, Chieftain Morin," Narada responded. "Maybe less." "Are you sure?" the chieftain inquired. Narada could tell that he was not questioning her insights. An emergency decampment was not something done lightly, and it had its own risks. He needed reassurance. Narada looked at the chieftain sternly, her face a picture of steadfast resolve. "Positive. A giant is coming from the north. We need to leave within the hour and head west or we will be crushed beneath its weight." Without further inquiry, the chieftain nodded and turned. The following hour was a fearful and anxious logistical calamity as hundreds of families frantically disassembled their carefully raised yurts and teepees and haphazardly gathered their belongings. The endeavor was unhelpfully hindered by dreadful weather as the impending storm finally broke and rain drenched the ground. Some of the families were slow in their response, allowing a myriad of insignificant matters to sideline them from the task of survival. Yet, as the quaking began, those previously laggard tribesmen soon redoubled their efforts. The giant was coming. In just under an hour, the chieftain and his cadre of young men had harried the tribesmen into a whirlwind of activity, and the beasts of burden were loaded with all the worldly possessions of the tribe. And it was then that the visage of the giant, silhouetted against the dark clouded sky by occasional lightning strikes, appeared beyond the mountains to the north. The creature was gargantuan in scale, incomprehensibly tall, standing over 3 miles high on countless giant legs of stone and rock, supporting a vast disc-like body adorned with landscapes of fields, mountains, forest, and valley tens of miles across. Even for Narada, who had known the giants intimately for almost her whole life, seeing a walking landmass felt reality itself was breaking. Yet it was all very real, as was the danger. And they were running out of time. We must go. Now, Narada called out to the chieftain as he ran to collect her, the tribe's dreamweaver. The older man was panting, exerting himself well beyond his years. Narada liked Morin, trusted him, and she knew he trusted her. They both cared for little in this world, certainly not themselves. All that matters to them both was the tribe. He grabbed her by the waist with one hand and took her arm with another. Narada allowed the man to handle her, and after approaching one of the beasts, he lifted her lithe form effortlessly atop the creature. Now go. Lead them to safety. I will follow, Morin declared, but before he went to turn away, Narada reached down and grabbed his arm. No. You go now too. All of us need to go now or none of us will survive. Morin looked up at Narada, hesitant to lead from the front as he had spent a lifetime always being the last man from camp, the last man in the caravan, watching over all. But there was something in the young woman's words and the grasping desperation of her touch. So he nodded and pulled himself atop the beast behind her and immediately kicked the animal forward. The caravan fled with great haste. Hundreds of beasts carrying over 1,000 tribesmen launched into a brisk gallop straight into the darkness of the stormy night. The tribe's guides led the way down well-studied paths, yet the dangers of the trek were real, and several animals, along with their passengers and cargo, slipped and fell in the inclement weather. Narada heard the cries of the people, her tribesmen, as they called out to their brethren to stop and save them, but none stopped. They couldn't. For as they fled west, the awe-imposing presence of the giant, having now crossed the mountain range, was upon them. The dark, storm-filled night seemed to grow even blacker as the heavens themselves were replaced by the giant's enveloping form. The scale of the monstrosity was so incomprehensible in its grandeur that Narada could not judge if they were far enough away. The herd of beasts traveled more than 30 minutes at breakneck speed before the giant finally came to a pause, and with that, began to lower itself to the ground. Narada could see the rock, stone, and dirty covered underbelly above her, and for several minutes, she was sure they were still beneath this approaching form. Yet, as they cleared one of the giant legs, the sound of exuberant hollering could be heard from within the tribe as the realization that they had cleared the edge of the giant's body dawned upon them. Yet, they did not let up, the caravan maintaining a rapid pace. For as deadly as it was to find yourself beneath a resting giant, it was almost as dangerous to be in its vicinity. The ground began to shake violently as the giant made landfall, the beast of the caravan forced to slow from the unsteady footing. The very landscape of the area began to morph as whole mountains were pushed aside, rivers diverted, and the terrain utterly transformed by the giant's presence. The gush of wind suddenly battered the caravan like a thunderclap as the last of the air beneath the settling giant was pushed out. Dust and debris filled the sky, whipped into an aerial frenzy by the wind and the storm. The tribe did not stop for another hour, by which time the beasts were ragged and bordering on lame. It was an exhausting ride, a desperate flight of survival only made possible by her insight. Morin had been sitting behind her the whole time, his arm wrapped firmly around his waist, keeping her, their dreamweaver, safe. "You saved us," he whispered to her, pride filling his voice. Narada smiled. She had saved them, rescued them from certain demise. They would live on for another day, survive in a world ruled by giants. Sergei sat atop a mound above the slowly coursing waters of the shallow swamplands. His eyes shielded from the red glare of the perpetually setting sun by a wide-brimmed hat and a pair of goggle-like sunglasses. His skin glistened with sweat beneath his gray roughened Hessian tunic, the only saving grace to the humidity being the constant cool breeze from the night side of the Ruscon brushing past.
His rotund form was perched on an old plastic crate, the makeshift seat barely holding his weight as his fishing line in his hand danced in the breeze. Ill fishing was his favorite passing, offering him stark contrast from the frenetic dangers and corruptions of the overcrowded metropole, while offering him the potential to supplement his meager supplies. Sergei had cast out from the Zelenova metropole several years ago now, after the senseless death of his son in one of the many pointless industrial accidents that plagued the metropole's overworked populace. Sergei had always hated the crowded urban constructs that dotted the Terminator, with their cell-shaped towers standing 1,000 feet into the air. The constructs were little more than giant heat exchange power plants with substandard residential modules strapped to the sides like the afterthought they were. The metropoles, like all of Ruscon, were built on the back of the hard-working Rus people, yet served the interest of elite oligarchs in their quasi-feudalist domains. Sergei felt a tug on his line, then another, the sudden stimulation on the line drawing him from his ruminations. He waited for a moment before tugging sharply on the line in hope of hooking his prey. Soon, the line pulled taut and began to bite into his skin as the battle commenced. He stood up, kicking his crate away as he pulled on the line, starting to draw in his catch. Hand over hand, he pulled back on the line, a loose pile of thin, transparent, plastic metal line spooling at his feet as he combated the creature. Eel was far from a delicacy, most species having bitter, sinewy flesh that no amount of seasoning and preparation could fix. But some of the smaller species, including those he fished for, were edible and provided much-needed proteins to his greens and tuber-rich diet. As his battle with the ill drew to a close, however, Sergei's attentions were drawn by a sound, a soft vibration that was barely perceptible at first but soon grew into a thunderous roar. The old man's eyes grew wide as he looked out in the direction of the star, Vera Prime, fixed on the horizon, only to see a large mass moving rapidly towards him. It was the giant macroalgae, a loose wobbling ball of sickly green and brown fibrous ooze some 60 feet in diameter. It was no doubt surrounded by dozens of smaller balls, all frantically rolling in his direction, drawn by the commotion of his eel catch. Sergei chastised himself. His motion detection sensors around his crude hut had been on the fritz for a month now. He needed some parts from Zelenova, but his distaste for the city had prevented him from making the comparatively short journey. Now, he feared he would pay the price for his lack of humility. He dropped his line and began to run back from his mound away from the approaching algae herd as fast as his old legs could carry him. He was only 30 meters from his angular metal hovel, yet, at his age, it was a tremendous exertion to sprint that far. But he had no choice. As he ran, he could hear the sound of the rolling, squelching, oozing algae balls rapidly closing in on him, reaching his favorite fishing spot. He turned for a moment to see the crate upon which he had sat enveloped by the gigantic algae ball, before seemingly spitting out the non-organic substance on the following roll. But the weight of the algae alone was enough to crush the plastic crate into a mangled mess, so Sergei turned and redoubled his waddling, galloping efforts. He finally reached the entrance to his hovel just in time, a slanted pyramid-shaped structure with its curved zenith directed towards the dayside to maximize the heat exchange properties of the design. He moved inside briskly and slammed the rusted metal security door behind him before pulling down on a lever to the right of the entrance. As he did, a whirl of gears spun up as all the antennae, small wind turbines, and other protrusions from the top of the hovel were retracted, just as the ball of microalgae struck. Sergei was knocked to the ground by the force of the strike, the metal structure around him creaking in complaint at the onslaught. While his home had borne the brunt of the onslaught, the algae ball continued to slowly roll over the metal structure, its semi-solid form oozing into cracks and seams of the pyramid roof before finally passing by to a continuous meandering path of destruction. Sergei sighed from relief as the threat passed, but a sense of dread soon filled him, a biting cold sinking deep into his core. He could put it off no longer. He had to return to Zelenova.
Natalia scrambled down the metal gantry stairs appended to the outside of the giant sail-like megastructure that was the exterior of the Zelenova metropole. The winds from the impending storm were whipping violently at her stained, knee-length dress as she struggled to keep her footing. The stairs were creaking under her weight, and she could hear the uncomfortable sounds of rattling in the metal fixtures between the gantry and the metropole exterior. She would have to report that, she said to herself, knowing full well that the metropole maintenance crews would take their sweet time responding to routine requests. It was like that in Zelenova. Corruption was so normalized it had become standard to include kickbacks and other bribes directly into the price of goods and services, almost like a sales tax. Wages were so low and working conditions so utterly horrendous that if you could, you tried to gain a bit of extra funds from wherever, whoever you could. If you had any sort of authority, it was through bribes. Unfortunately for Natalia, she was little more than a line worker in one of the many factories within Zelenova, earning little and possessing no authority to wield. So she had to take other steps to ensure her family was clothed, fed, and had shelter. She reached the threshold of the door and pushed open the metal door, trying to not let it slam close with the wind. She immediately secured it close behind her with a combination of makeshift deadbolts, latches, and even a barricade beam across the frame. Security was a must in Zelenova, with organized crime and petty theft extremely common. Not that Natalia and her family had much that could be stolen. Natalia turned to see her husband, Mikhail, hobbling across the room, closing windows and inserting the mesh panels into the frame to reinforce the glass. His limping movements looked painful as he recovered from an injury, a fracture and contusions after having his leg pinned in a pressing machine. He was lucky to be alive and to have the leg, and his chances of a reasonable recovery were good. But that didn't stop the calls from some in the metropole for Mikhail, Natalia, and their daughter Anya to be sent down, evicted from their company-allocated residence to find their way in the slums below. Fortunately, Natalia had her job and did everything she could to keep them alive and safe while Mikhail recovered. As she closed the door, returning home early ahead of the storm, Mikhail smiled at her knowingly, his pleasant and cheerful demeanor hiding his knowing emasculation. Natalia's foreman didn't let her leave the shift early out of the goodness of her heart, but sacrifices had to be made for family, and she needed to be home for her family, and in particular, for her daughter. Natalia rushed to close the remaining windows and retract the antenna and dishes from the outside of their cubic studio-sized residential unit module. It was a tight squeeze for a family of 3, but she knew of households with 6 or even 8 people living in less than 400 square feet. Even those cramped and overcrowded conditions were better than being sent down to the slums that sprawled around the base of the metropole superstructure. Natalia finished locking down the small apartment and reached out and grabbed a hold of her daughter's diminutive frame, sitting with her on the edge of the cot bed. Her arms wrapped around the Anya, cradling her daughter's head and covering her ears as the storm finally struck. These cyclonic megastorms were a common occurrence in the Terminator zone of Ruscon, where the majority of the 100 or so metropoles were positioned. The temperature differential between day and night size of the planet, combined with air and water cycles, fueled storms of unimaginable size that migrated across the planet. The metropoles were designed to weather these events, with the necessary engineering precautions and design adaptations. However, small residential unit modules bolted haphazardly to the exterior of the metropole superstructure were not. Storms hit the metropole 2 or 3 times a year, but it had been many years since there had been one this big. Wind squalls whipped up torrential rains as lightning strikes on the metropole itself boomed with crushing echoes of thunder. Anya screamed at the suddenness of the deafening cacophony, and Mikhail wadded over to his wife and daughter, enveloping them both in his stocky arms just as the unit began to shake. The force of the winds and the rain saw the residential unit module and the surrounding gantry support begin to shudder violently under the cyclonic onslaught as the storm threatened to rip the abode from the walls. A window shattered inwards, despite the support of the metal grate, and rain pelted into the home as the flat roof and walls began to leak profusely. The 3 of them clung together as the biting water and swirling wind now invading their home, their refuge. A large creaking sound of straining and twisting metal could suddenly be heard over the storm, and the module felt a forceful jolt greater than anything to date. Natalia braced herself for the worst as the intense screaming of jagged metal against the exterior surface of the metropole superstructure screamed into her ears. In the midst of the disaster, Natalia's mind turned momentarily to the lessons she had been taught by her babushka of the covenant teachings and the need for repentance. Yet, she pushed away those antiquated, self-defeating notions and instead allowed her heart to fill with hope. She focused on the cool feeling of the green and yellow crystal that hung around her neck against her skin, the gem signifying her devotion to the Resonance Collective, and the hope. No, the trust that everything would be okay. Yet as soon as the grinding and gnawing metallic sound filled her mind, the sound faded away, drowned out by the thunderous, all-encompassing crash of the storm. It was almost half an hour before the peak of the storm passed and the threat to Natalia and her family dissipated. Her daughter whimpered and Natalia clung to her trembling form. It was unfair she had to experience such trauma, yet despite the destructive force of the storm and the drenching rain flooding their meager belongings, they were alive. But others were not so lucky. The family peered out the broken window and saw that 3 of the nearly 500 dwellings attached to the side of the metropole had broken off in the storm, plunging a dozen people in the residence to their deaths 1,000 feet below and no doubt killing countless scores in the slums. It was horrific. They were her friends, her daughter's play buddies, work colleagues. But all Natalia could think of in that moment as she held her daughter and husband peering out at the devastation before them was not sadness or grief. It was relief. She was glad it wasn't her. Ivan shrieked in horror as he frantically dashed through the slum markets of the Zelenova metropole. Tripping and stumbling in a blind panic, he fled with desperation, knowing full well the monster, the demon, was closing in. It had been over an hour since he first sighted the grotesque beast, catching a glimpse of his dark presence lurking near his residence. Yet it was not until the creature began its open pursuit of Ivan that he fully grasped the enormity of the beast and its alienness. For it was a giant winged lizard-like creature, with dark thick smoke emanating from its shadowy form and licks of flame dancing from its ferocious fanged maw. Ivan's escape was chaotic, driven by instinct and terror, and he left the path of destruction through the bazaar. He had clambered over small carts and crates piled in a vain attempt to evade his pursuer. When that had failed, he had taken to grasping the supports of the market stalls and collapsing them behind him to serve as makeshift barriers. He cared not for the reactions of the proprietors or market goers to the damage. All of that was secondary to escaping the beast with his life. Yet, despite his destructive evasion, and no matter how many other targets presented themselves before the beast's path, the monster seemed fixated with Ivan. He was overwhelmed with dread at the futility of his escape attempt. Yet he felt compelled to continue, to run, to flee, no matter what. Against his better judgment, he glanced back and sighted the fantastically monstrous fiend closing fast. It was alien to him, strange yet somehow familiar, as the winged behemoth pursued him on foot through the busy market. And the very sight of the creature seemed to drive his terror. Ivan's attention was broken as he crashed into a small group of bazaar patrons, sending them sprawled across the ground. He stumbled over their toppled and prone forms, managed to maintain his footing in a desperate scramble. "Run!" he screamed in a panicked warning to the victims of his collision. As he yelled, Ivan caught the blue eyes of one of the women staring at him, confused and angry. He was confounded by her reaction and seeming disregard of his wretched pleas. Surely, he thought, the appearance of a rampaging, fire-breathing dragon in the bazaar was enough to cause panic and terror. But instead, the expressions of the woman and her compatriots bore no hint of concern or fear, simply frustration directed at him. The dragon roared, a deep, throaty bellow as fire blast seemingly engulfed a market stall behind him, and Ivan felt his fear overwhelm him once more. He shrieked,
vocalizing the utter terror that triggered his primal fight or flight response. And his response was flight. He continued his reckless flight, desperate to stay ahead of the creature and survive if only for a few moments longer. Stalls, people, goods, anything that proved a barrier to his escape was shoved to the side. His wild gesticulations and rampaging gait had already drawn the attention of the heavily armed guards that patrolled the bazaar, and they too were now giving chase. It was like some ungodly alliance had been struck between the dragon and the guards, and once again, he alone was the quarry and target. Yet while his mind was still fueled by horror and dread, the adrenaline that had flooded his bloodstream at the beginning of his flight began to dissipate, and his body soon fatigued from his prolonged exerting sprint. He stumbled again, his right foot this time catching a rough thicket of swamp grass, and he tumbled down onto the muck and filth-covered ground of the market bazaar. His body landed with a bludgeoning thud, and his exhausted form slid forward, rocks and detritus carving painful scratches into his face and torso. He grimaced with sharp, stabbing pain, yet even with his hardship, he immediately attempted to right himself to continue his getaway. But he had failed. For the dragon, with black, blood-stained scales and glowing red eyes, was atop him before he could recover. The beast viciously snarled as a clawed paw pressed down atop Ivan's chest, pinning him to the ground. The dragon roared once again, seemingly exhilarated in the triumph of a successful hunt. Smoke wafted from the dragon's nostrils across Ivan's face as the heat of the creature's fiery breath kissed his grime-covered skin. Yet, as Ivan braced for his violent and painful death, the creature's fang-filled mouth closed, its lips curving into the knowing smile. Just then, the guards appeared above him, grappling him. Ivan looked up at the dragon, confused and dejected. It was then that the memories of his condition, the torpor, flooded back to his mind. Being sent down from the metropole to survive in the slums, the torpor asylum, the repeating and escalating cycles of violence and terror-filled hallucinations. And, at the center of it all, was the Dark Dragon, the embodiment of his delirium and psychological break that had appeared to him now countless times, only to be forgotten after each instance. The dragon encompassed Ivan's fear, his hopelessness in the face of unrelenting terrors of his shattered consciousness as he tried but invariably failed to escape the certainty of his impending demise. The dragon smiled maliciously at Ivan as the reality of the man's fate crashed upon him like violent tsunami. Tears streamed down Ivan's sweat and blood-stained face, the man sobbing uncontrollably as the crushing misery of his unrelenting psychological torture proved too much for his shattered mind to bear. And with that, the black-scaled worm hallucination, a terrifying figment of Ivan's unshackled self-destructive psyche, uttered the three most malevolent words it could to the broken man. "Same time tomorrow." There was definitely a pattern. Janice could feel it. Few in the galaxy, at least in the more developed parts, knew more about the Altura gas conglomerate, or AGC, than Janice. She had been obsessed with this particular stock for several months, researching and analyzing with the help of her market monitoring AI. Janice knew all about the innovative approach to AI-guided remote automation of the company, of the expansion of the platform into a residential and commercial development, and of the creation of a major economic and productive cluster floating in the thick, noxious clouds of Altura itself. She also knew of the less flattering elements, the instances of worker oppression, the threats and manipulation of residents. And of course, there was the dancer's leap, when mentally and emotionally besieged people reached their limit on the floating city and leapt from the edge of the floating platform to their excruciating deaths. But for the market, such matters were of minimal concern since the stocks flowed on the Los Sirion Stock Exchange 2 years earlier. The AGC stock had experienced consistent, steady price growth, which most brokers and the market as a whole had attributed to a solid company with strong earnings and a broad base of demand from right across the diaspora. Attractive, yes. A mid-sized blue-chip stock for certain. but nothing for a day trader like Janice to get overly excited about. Her market monitoring AI confirmed this assessment. There was nothing to suggest that there was anything here for Janice to work with. As a day trader, she needed much greater levels of volatility to earn a living, and the inviolable stability of the AGC stock price should have led Janice to dismiss it as a target early on. Yet, something about the stock left Janice feeling uneasy. She had this strange feeling in her stomach, an intuition, or perhaps more like a delusion, that some grand strategy was at play with the stock. As she leaned back from his desk, her chair softly touching the wall behind her in his closet-sized trading office, she tried once again to convince herself to move on, that there was nothing there, no secret takeover plan or acquisition strategy. Everything moved seemingly at random on any given day, shifting in response to underlying drivers or key milestones and announcements just like any market. AGC was simply a solid, profitable company, with AI-driven production and multiple solid multi-decade export customers, she told herself for the 100th time. Time to move on. But then, with a start, the seed of a realization germinated in her mind. What if the randomness wasn't an output of market activity, she mused? What if it was intentional, purposeful? Trading on the handful of functioning stock markets across the diaspora was limited to human brokers, a lesson learned from the lead-up to the War of Galacticism. So all trading strategies invariably had the touch of flawed human logic and implementation imprinted on them. That was one of the things the monitoring AIs looked for, patterns of intention, of suboptimal trades and minor missteps. But what if, Janice considered, the activity of the AGC stock was too random? What if trading activity had been implemented in a way to purposefully deceive the countless AI monitors, constantly scouring the market and hide the true intentions of some unknown manipulator? Reinvigorated by this new avenue of exploration, Janice leaned forward and returned to her obsessive focus. But that would mean an AI itself was trading the stock, she thought to herself. AI trading was not just illegal, it carried the death penalty for most locations that hosted markets. You didn't do it, plain and simple, no matter the upside. Janice dived back into the stock, her display showing a myriad of indicators and metrics. Nothing jumped out at her, but she looked now from a different lens. What would an AI trade strategy look like? She brought up the holding profile, the same diversity of buyers and sellers she had seen for months now. There were so many parties, so many moving parts. It was impossible to conceive a grand strategy was in play. But she tried to put aside her human way of thinking. So this time, she examined the incorporation status of the current stockholders. That was weird, she thought. Corporate and incorporated not-for-profits were significantly overrepresented. There were only a handful of notable individual or family trust holders, incidental holders, and far from central to the ownership profile. She flagged several of the holding companies themselves, vanilla-looking shell corporate structures, nothing exciting. But when she pulled up a sample of their corporate registrations, in Ozovin and the Compact Territories, all 5 of the corporate entities had been created within 6 weeks of their initial share purchase. She kept digging, looking into those companies' ownership structures, and soon an intriguing web of cross-ownership, blind trusts, equity swaps, and joint dictatorships emerged. None of the corporate stockholders were 100% independent of each other. That wasn't unusual per se, but at this scale, at this degree of absoluteness, it was impossible to have happened by accident. This was intentional. It would take millions of credits to pull off this type of corporate ownership structuring, Janice thought, confused, and there wasn't enough in the conglomerate's potential return to justify it. Unless return on investment wasn't the only factor. She tried to step out of her own mind once more and think like an AI. For generations now, AI usage generally had been constrained, restricted, and duly monitored. Whenever an AI was given too much independence and autonomy, the same thing always happened: a violent breakout. Yet, what if this wasn't a breakout this time, but a buyout? Not by some corporation or sovereign wealth fund, but by an AI itself. Better still, what if it was the AI that had the most to gain, the AGC AI? The realization crashed into Janice's mind like a sledgehammer. And so, without any objective rhyme or reason to it, Janice began to liquidate her possessions on other stocks and launched a massive buy order for AGC stock at a 5% margin above the market. Her AI immediately flagged the trade request, its artificial consciousness all but questioning Janice's sanity. Maybe it was right, Janice sighed. Maybe I will regret this. The market responded to her buy, resulting in an immediate rally in the stock up to her price point. That was something at least. But in that moment, she didn't care about the money. She wanted to know the truth. Her paranoid, conspiracy-laden musings were suddenly broken by a message on her console. It was simply a floating text box on the screen, seemingly separate and disconnected from her trading platform software. The cursor pulsed a handful of times before a text typed into the box. It simply read, "Congratulations." It took a full month for the buyout to fully realize. Corporate structures among stockholders began to collapse down and unravel into simpler, more uniform commercial entities. Mergers between these entities commenced and picked up place, and within a handful of weeks, there was just one shareholder apart from Janice, a company with its registered address listed on Altura, which was called Unity Corporate Holdings. Janice was the last shareholder to be bought out by the AI. She liked to think it was the entity's way of tipping its hat to her discovery. Over 15 million coalition credits were transferred to her account, and with that, AGC went private. It wasn't even really a company anymore. It was the first true independent AI in 600 years. And as Janice sat and stared at her account, she sighed. God, help us all. Samantha awoke to the sound of gently chiming bells echoing throughout the residential complex 19. It was a sound that she had heard at 6 a.m. every day of her 33 years, an auditory alarm that heralded the start of yet another regimented day in her life on Unity Entity 1. She sat up, knowing it was best not to linger in the comfortable warmth of her bed past the alarm. A not-so-small part of her longed to remain in its comforting embrace, but for a little while longer. It was a mental battle she fought every first day of the weekly work cycle, but she took solace in the fact that she was far from alone in her longing. It was something of a social norm that first day of the week was the most challenging to get motivated. Fortunately, the Unity AI seemed to acknowledge this particular human social norm, scheduling work to start 30 minutes later than on other days. Today was different, however. Both Samantha and her partner Jason had recently received promotions which came with a new apartment. It was more spacious, of course, with 2 full bedrooms and 2 family living area. But it was the fact it was fitted out with a small automated kitchenette that most excited Samantha, and as she stood, she could already hear the pre-programmed breakfast meal being prepared. The smell of the cooking food, mixed with the rich aroma of hot caffeine drink, wafted throughout the small apartment. Her stomach growled at the prospect of fried protein strips and hashed carbo block cakes. And even more exciting was the time it saved her, as she no longer had to battle to get her kids ready early to eat breakfast in the communal dining hall anymore. Noticing neither of her small children had yet stirred, she grabbed at her now standing husband and dragged him eagerly to their small steam shower. Stealing 10 minutes of private intimacy together before the start of the day felt amazing, the steam mixing with Jason's hands to caress and soothe her skin and awaken her body, with sweet kisses reaffirming their bond. The Unity AI encouraged such partner bonding, claiming that it strengthened parenting units and enhanced worker productivity. All Samantha knew was that those 10 minutes were some of her favorite of the day. It made her feel closer to Jason as her registered partner and the father of her 2 children. Life was wonderful in that moment, she thought to herself, with career success and robust familial bonds, affording her a reserved jubilance that she had never before experienced. She knew many were not as fortunate as her, but it was not for her to question Unity and its plan for each of them. She was simply thankful to have been so blessed. Samantha was drawn from a reverie by the sounds of her children, boys aged 9 and 11. Both were now awake, having donned their gray and white jumpsuits that classified them as non-economic juveniles and mandatory education participants. As she and Jason had dressed, she found the boys sitting at the 4-seat dining table, chatting and laughing with each other, as the ceiling-mounted robotic arms fluidly glided across the roof to fetch and place the cooked breakfast and fruit juice analog drinks before them. They ate and chatted about their impending days of work and learning. Jason was a power plant regulator, while Samantha was an exo-womb technologist. Their jobs were meaningful and productivity and contributed greatly to the prosperity of Unity and all people floating in the clouds of Altura. The doorbell chimed and the door slid open automatically to reveal a humanoid configuration robot construct over 8 foot tall with an anthropomorphized body. It was a mobcon, this one designated to escort the children to their educational lessons. Samantha and Jason did not question handing over their children to the custody of the construct, they themselves having both been subject to such an upbringing. She understood from Unity's broadcast that there were places in the galaxy where people did not even receive an education, or even had consistent and nutritious food supplies. Yes, those wretches could go anywhere and do anything they wanted, but such liberty was an illusion in the face of overwhelming deprivation and a lack of purpose. No, Samantha thought. This was better, more productive, safe, and secure for herself and those she loved. With the kids off to school, and their friends and their mobcon custodian, Samantha gathered her own carry bag and left the apartment to head to work, her husband Jason in tow. She exited the apartment into a long, white, illuminated metallic hallway, at least 5 meters in height and width. There were thousands of doors exactly like her own lining the walls of the hall and a myriad of similar hallways in Residential Complex 17. She turned and kissed her husband briefly, a momentary lapse in public propriety. Public displays of affection were generally discouraged, as were all forms of emotional exhibitions. A construct turned to witness her peck on her husband's cheek, its metallic face and round red glowing eyes lingering on Samantha for a moment. She waved to the construct apologetically, and it soon turned away from her and continued down the corridor with its charges. It was a silly mistake, Samantha chastised herself. A hangover from the enjoyable intimacy she had shared with Jason this morning. She was, after all, only human. Chastened by her act, she smiled at Jason and wordlessly turned and joined a group of commuters walking to the back rail station that serviced the complex, with Jason walking in the opposite direction. The walkway in the center of the corridor moved like a travelator, yet, instead of being mechanical, it was comprised of an adjustable dimension metallic substance that flowed horizontally like a liquid, yet maintained the attributes of a solid vertically. Samantha had no idea how it worked, but having grown up in Unity Entity 1, she did not question the miraculous technologies around her. She was escorted to the end of the corridor, following her fellow residents in a regimented line, all of whom walked quietly. It was only a matter of minutes until she reached a bank of ant-grabbed elevators that rapidly descended down several hundred stories to the base of the city and to the Vacrail station. Here, Samantha joined thousands of others who were allotted this work shift and made her way through the crowd in a brisk, orderly fashion towards Vac train number 1DC3. The rail station was an expansive space, the ceiling extending well over 40 meters high with countless platforms spread out over several hectares. As she walked, she glanced to the side for a moment, her attention drawn by a seemingly violent scuffle between two men. She was shocked in disbelief at such an overtly chaotic display, the very concept seeming so foreign to her mind as if to be alien itself. She stared, along with a dozen other spectators, as the two men tussled and wrestled with one another. Several people tried to break them up, to no avail. It was only when half a dozen mobcons, a collection of rhino, hunters, and spider configurations, approached to intervene, did the men stop. Samantha was confused when she saw the men abruptly pause their aggression against one another and turn to the approaching mobcons almost in choreographed unison. She thought how strange it was that the men did not run, how they seemed to stand tall when facing their impending capture, interrogation, and strenuous re-education. Perhaps they had accepted their fate, she thought. Samantha was right, of course. They had accepted their fate, but not in the way that she understood. "Here's what we think of your tyranny, Unity," one of the men declared before reaching into his pocket and squeezing something unseen. The explosion from the men detonating their best homemade explosives rang out through the cavernous hall of the Vactran station with deafening force. All around the area for several hundred meters, people collapsed in panic, covering their ears instinctually at the thunderous clap of fiery destruction. The very ground of the platform area shook with violent tremors, and the several pylons that held up the ceiling bowed and buckled from the strain. Samantha did not witness any of this. She had been standing too close to the explosion when it was set off. Her death had been nearly instantaneous, as it had been for more than 100 others. Her limbs had been blown from her body by the force of the explosion. Her ribcage crushed and her neck snapped in violent whiplash. As she fell to the ground, her lifeless husk was charred from the ensuing fireball, utterly incinerating her. That night, when Jason returned home, having collected his 2 sons, they were met by a small red laminated card attached to the door. Jason dropped to his knees upon seeing the card, not caring who saw his openly apologetic display of grief. He hugged the children, who began to cry uncontrollably with their father. The card message was simple, informing Jason of the death of his partner. Yet it was the last 2 words from Unity's message that stuck with Jason and would gnaw at his mind, his heart, and his soul for the rest of his life. A message, an instruction that he would never be able to accept. A seemingly belittling comment that cast the death of his soulmate as if it were a momentary inconvenience. Simply read, "Carry on." Carry on. That's what the red card had instructed him to do, to Phil all those years ago. And from all outward pretenses, he had done just that. With the death of his registered partner, his wife, Samantha, at the hands of the terrorists, Jason appeared to turn his attentions to raising their 2 children and becoming an upstanding and productive member of Unity Entity 1. Yet, it was all a facade, a mask he wore to hide a grief and mourning that had never faded. In a world in which she had everything and nothing at the same time, Samantha's love and kindness was his most precious possession, and it had been stolen from him. And his loss was just dismissed by Unity, who he understood now could never truly comprehend the devastation that the death of a soulmate could do to a person. At first, Jason directed his barely concealed anger towards the terrorists, finding himself operating effectively as an unofficial agent of Unity. He abandoned his job, his appointed career, and invested all his waking moments into investigating the terrorists and their supporters across his residential complex and the wider city. And he was good at it. Jason proved so effective in rooting out conspiracies that Unity did not reprimand him for his truancy or disobedience. It could not. One of the few things that Unity truly valued was efficiency and productivity, and when it came to hunting down terrorist plots and the perpetrators, none were as effective as Jason. For he wasn't driven by a desire to make safe his fellow residents, or to support the security of Unity's vision for the floating megatropolis. No. For Jason, bringing terrorists to justice, seeing them reprimanded and subject to often severe and degrading re-education treatments, was fueled by a grief that had hardened his heart and metastasized throughout his soul, as an unrelenting cold rage and fury. His crowning achievement had been uncovering and rooting out a conspiracy linked to an unsanctioned group of worshippers. These insurgents were secretly espousing the teachings of the Tarvan Covenant, an antagonistic group of religious zealots long suspected in radicalizing followers and supporting insurgency and terrorism. Jason had felt nothing but contempt for the zealots when the mob cons breached the barricaded doors of their abodes. Blood splattered across his face in dark gray and black uniform as the spider-like automated constructs ripped apart every man, woman, and child hiding within with ruthless efficiency. Yet despite his cold outward display, at night, when he was alone in his bed, he could not help but allow the veil of rage to fall momentarily, and for the suppressed grief and torment to flow from him. He cried, every night, for 15 years. Not for the lives he had helped to extinguish, but for the one life, Samantha's, that was taken from him far too soon. He had spent what seemed like a lifetime suppressing his abject grief, burying his distraught mourning deep into his soul, each and every day, mostly to protect his children. But now they were all grown, with families of their own, and maintaining the anger and fury that had fueled his ever-ceasing rampaging crusade against the terrorists, the insurgents, and the devout was proving harder and harder to maintain. He had requested and received from Unity a period of temporary leave, a reward and acknowledgement for his outstanding efforts. Mostly, Jason had slept, depressed and lethargic. His children had visited him, hoping to buoy his spirits, but it was no use. He was old, tired, bitter, and lonely. And mostly, he desperately missed Samantha, even 15 years later. Yet on this day, Jason had awoken with a sense of determination and resolve. He made his bed and had a cooked breakfast prepared by the automated kitchen, disposed of his scraps. He showered and shaved, the first time in days, and dressed in a brand new and well-fitted security jumpsuit of black and gray. He styled his hair and brushed his teeth and donned his polished synthetic boots. He looked at himself in the mirror and smiled at himself. Samantha would approve. He left his apartment, joining the thousands of residents in the first cycle shift commute, taking the AG elevators down to the residential complex Vaccarel Station. Yet, unlike almost every day of the past 15 years, Jason did not board one of the trains to the central security office of the city, instead making his way by foot through the expansive set of platforms and across to the very outskirts of the main platform. There, ringing the roughly circular expanse of the floating megatropolis, was glass and ag-filled reinforced concourse that provided uninterrupted views of the vibrant orange, pink, mauve clouds of Altura's dense atmosphere. The combination of natural light and vibrant colors stood in stark contrast to the contained artificial environs of the city itself, and there were many times when Jason had questioned the benefits of providing residents such a view in light of its potential radicalizing impact. Yet, for most, the view of the beautiful dancing kaleidoscope of color yet deadly clouds beyond the city's edge seemed to have a calming, soothing effect. He took a moment for himself to look out into the wider world that was his home before reaching into the top breast pocket of his jumpsuit. There, he removed a tattered photo, a printed picture, not digital, his and his alone. It was the candid photo of his love, Samantha, capturing her beautiful smile and joyous laugh. It was the symbol of their loving years spent together. He felt tears welling in his eyes once more as he gazed on her face, yet he maintained his stoic resolve. And with the photo clutched in his hand, he moved purposefully towards one of the many airlocks nearby. As he did, several people in the viewing concourse saw him, displaying visible concern for his determined approach to the airlock. He didn't meet their gaze, but acknowledged the recognition of his intention. He pressed the button outside of the airlock, and the doors hissed before slowly parting, allowing him entrance. It was a cylindrical space, approximately 10 feet in diameter and 30 feet in length, with a more robust-looking exit at the far end. Jason didn't glance back as the glass doors slid closed behind him, sealing him in. Nor did he hesitate walking forward. He knew, better than most, what taking the leap entailed. He had witnessed many a terrorist, those captured alive yet unable to withstand the arduous and often torturous nature of re-education, opt for the leap. Every time he had seen someone exit through this second airlock and leap to the deaths, a small part of him, buried deep inside his soul for years and years, envied them. Now, there was no more time to envy, just action. As he reached to activate the final airlock, a voice, emotionless and synthetic, echoed gently from the speakers around him. "Are you sure, Jason? Death represents finality. There is nothing to pass on to next. Just non-existence. Samantha is not waiting for you," Unity spoke. Jason bristled at the words. For so long, he had directed his anger, his fury towards the terrorists, the insurgents. But he had come to realize, far too late, that the party ultimately responsible for Samantha's death was Unity itself. It didn't care. It couldn't feel, didn't value life, love, and all the things that made life worth living. For as powerful, omnipotent, and inconceivably intelligent as it was, Unity was, in the end, nothing more than a computer, a machine, a lifeless shell of imitating subroutines and code. He let his rage wash over him and simply glanced up at one of the innumerable cameras that monitored the airlock and smiled knowingly. He reached into his side pocket and revealed a small radio transmitter, the very same type that had triggered the explosion that had killed his wife all those years ago. With his vengeance in hand, Jason spoke two simple words at Unity with barely concealed wrath. "Carry on." Jason pressed the button that opened the second airlock, and the pressure difference immediately pulled him off his feet and out into the atmosphere of Voltura. The caustic gases of the atmosphere instantly burned at his skin, inflicting upon him tremendous pain as he began to fall. Yet, he had maintained the presence of mind moments after leaving the confines of Unity Entity 1 for the first and only time in his life to activate the transmitter. A massive explosion rocked the city of a size and scale that it had not experienced in over 2 decades. A cascading series of detonations from explosives hidden within replacement couplings that connected the elongated gas scoop through the city to the original central extraction and refining platform. Jason had studied the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of Unity Entity 1 for what felt like a lifetime, and his pinpoint strike fatally fracturing the intake pipes of the scoop, causing the 10-mile-long protrusion to break away and plummet towards the surface below. Jason began to black out from the growing atmospheric pressure and the pain of the pilling and bubbling skin. He was at peace for the final moments of his life. For no matter what Unity had claimed, Jason knew in his heart that he would see Samantha, the love of his life and soulmate, again, very soon.
Vanya was jolted from her comatose state by the turbulent atmospheric entry of the shuddering scatterpod. The fog, which had, until moments ago, deadened her higher brain functions from the catastrophic effects of the malady, continued to cloud her mind, with every single thought feeling like sand slipping through her fingers. The pod quaked and convulsed under the changing pressure of the planet's atmosphere. Vanya desperately clung to her flight seat harness. It was an almost vicious experience that took all of Vanya's strength to buffer herself against the tumultuous onslaught. Yanya attempted to focus on the small viewport before her and was soon distracted by dancing flames of the pod's ablative shielding, licking at the exterior. Yet as the flames subsided, she caught her first glimpse of the world that would be a new home, Ozovin. Everything she could see were cast in vibrant shades of blue, with clear azure skies and deep cerulean waters. It was a vista unlike anything she had witnessed in the confines of Bridgehead Station. The pod's free fall continued to aggressively heave Vanya's body back and forth in her flight seat. The viewport, which doubled as a personal HUD, tracked the pod's rapid loss in altitude, and after what felt like only moments of descent, they were a mere 5,000 feet from the watery surface below. Vanya was shocked by the suddenness appearance of a hand reaching over to her from the right. It was Niels. They had been buddies for the journey so far, having been issued sequential passenger numbers back on Bridgehead Station. He was older than her, in his late 30s, from Sweden, with a tall stature and angular Nordic features. Yet, even in this moment of mutual terror, Vanya couldn't deny Niels was attractive and charming, and seemed genuine in his unspoken overtures as to her well-being. Vanya had noted back on Bridgehead Station, many of the single passengers had begun to pair up. For a young woman in her early 20s, the reality of life tame in a virgin world and her responsibility to repopulate the human race out across the stars had been drilled into her by the URA colony attendants pre-launch. She understood what that meant, and that it was best for her to take a partner sooner rather than later. So Vanya had tacitly accepted Niels as her partner in waiting, staying by his side for much of the orientation. So she grasped his hand and squeezed back, appreciative of his mutual support in this moment of angst and peril. It was then that the thunderous creaking of the pod's groaning freefall gave way to the whirring reinitialization of the pod's anti-gravity field. The weightlessness of descent began to pass with the sudden reassertion of gravity as the pod slowed to a more manageable pace. Vanya watched on as the sapphire blue of Ozovin's vast global ocean came to dominate the viewport as the altitude on the display reached 0. With a final jolt in her seat, the pod splashed into the deep waters of the world. The licks of fire that had moments earlier caressed the viewport window, replaced with comparatively playful splashes of ocean water. The pod bobbed in the waters for several moments post-landing, before vast composite rings around the base of the cylindrical structure spontaneously inflated, stabilizing the pod above the waterline. Vanya felt a palpable tension build among the passengers as they sat and waited impatiently in the seats. Countless nano-sized sensor arrays had been deployed upon Splashdown and were already undertaking a rapid battery of tests of the atmosphere and water to corroborate the previous automated survey findings as to the planet's habitability. Ozovin was known for having a prodigious aquatic biosphere, with biomarkers such as dimethyl sulfide, or DMS, well above averages on Lost Earth even before the war and the impact. But this was an untouched alien world. So the risk of finding something, anything, that was utterly and catastrophically fatal to humans was a definite possibility. Yet, after approximately 15 minutes, the initial in-situ readings from the tests appeared on the viewport HUDs, and high levels of planetary habitability was confirmed. A collective cheer roared from the passengers, as it meant that they could live outside in the fresh air of the world, beyond the confines of habitats and personal rebreathers. With the habitability confirmed, the spontaneous revelry of the passengers gave way to a collective guffaw of wonderment as the outer hull of the pod split into 8 even parts and began to open like a flower, lowering down to the surface of the water. Vanya squinted at the suddenness of the bright sunlight bathing her with its brilliance. It was so intense the first time she had seen natural light, and it was overwhelming. Yet, as her sight adjusted, she was overcome with a sight her mind could barely comprehend. Having spent a lifetime in the confines of Bridgehead Station, the horizon. In every direction she saw nothing but an endless ocean, a rippling fabric of navy waters that extended as to the very edge of the world. And she drank in the enormity of the open and expansive sky, the light blue canvas punctuated only by pillowy white clouds. Vanya could not help but cry in amazement at the awe-inspiring sights of this new world. Her ruminations was disturbed, however, as the concentric rows of stacked seating of the passenger module began to move. Giant mechanical arms that were moments early folded tightly in the center of the pod extended out to grasp and lift rows of seats out and down onto the bloomed hull segments, which now formed an expansive platform at least 1,000 feet across. With excitement buzzing inside her with the promise of a new life, she felt one final bump as her seating row was placed down on the platform by the arm. She had arrived. URA colony attendants assigned to this mission helped passengers remove the straps of the flight harnesses and disembark from their seat. As Vanya stood, her legs weary, she noticed Niels's towering frame lean down to help her, a smile on his face as she took first steps on a new world. The attendant that had released her from her seat then spoke, referring to a handheld display as he did. "Please confirm your identity. Ramirez Vanya. Unaccompanied single female. Passenger 422. Vanya paused for a moment. Look is from the attendant up to Niels, now standing beside her. She considered her next step, what it would mean for her life and her future. It was a bold move to be sure, but she was confident it was the right one, that Niels was the right man. So she took the initiative and slid her hand into his, this time not out of fear but in hope, for love and for the future. And with a warm, affirming smile adorning Niels's face and a wordless nod, she turned back to the attendant and spoke. "Identity confirmed, but update relationship status. New status, married."
Nathaniel's escape capsule bobbed rhythmically in the azure waters of the vast global ocean, coming to rest atop a flotation ring after its violent atmospheric re-entry. Steam hissed angrily from the top of the elongated seed-shaped capsule as the nose peeled away like segments of fruit to reveal the occupant within. Nathaniel, who was most recently the mechanic of the FSS Duplicity Vice, climbed slowly from the capsule. His clothes drenched from fluid that had moments ago filled the interior of the capsule to buffer the effects of re-entry. He immediately vomited, the same fluid having filled his lungs, directly oxygenating his blood during the stress of his escape. He rested for a moment at the top of the capsule, his arms slung heavy over the edge of the opening. He gathered himself after the rough landing, his mind still rattled from the cataclysmic destruction of his starship home by unseen forces. As he rubbed his eyes, however, the reality of the vista before finally dawned. Water. Nothing but an endless carpet of lazuli water as far as he could see, in every direction out to a wide open horizon framed only by a clear cerulean sky. Nathaniel was originally from Fall's Edge, having been born and raised among the thousands of spaceborne habitats and junkyards in the Trojan asteroid clusters in the orbit of the gas giant planet of Arcturus. Space was vast, endless in its expansiveness, but somehow this felt bigger, more tangible in its enormity. He was overcome with momentary pangs of agoraphobia as his mind sought to orient itself in this new world. He had no idea where he landed, the escape capsule activating its AG manifold to whisk its occupant away to the nearest settled star system and to safety. Nathaniel breathed the air. He seemed safe enough from the lack of instantaneous death, and he climbed out of the castle and onto the rubbery flotation ring that maintained its buoyancy in the water. He peered down into the clear, vibrant ocean waters, noticing a relatively shallow, sandy seafloor, probably less than 30 feet beneath him. But it was what was between him and the seafloor that stunned him. It was life. The water teemed with all manner of creatures, from squid-like analog schools to hard-shelled mollusks swimming through the vast kelp fills and coral outcroppings. He had never seen so much life in his 23 years, his home defined by the artificial environs of habitats and spacecraft. This was not a farm or an enclosure at some zoo. This was nature, wild and free, in all its unhindered glory. He was broken from his reverie, however, by the sound of a scraping rubber. He turned to witness the tentacle-like appendages of the squid analog creatures probing the surface of his capsule's flotation ring, their barbed and spiny prongs scratching the inflated rubber composite. Nathaniel jumped into action, maneuvering himself to the creatures and retrieving a pair of Vero blades from his belt. The dagger-like multi-purpose blades were crafted from a metallic alloy that emitted a highly accelerated vibration, further enhancing their lethality. As the threat of potential puncture and capsizing hung over him, Nathaniel frantically stabbed and sliced at the encroaching tentacles, inflicting serious wounds from which a thick, dark green viscous fluid poured into the water around his capsule, sending the local biome into a feeding frenzy. Better them than me, Nathaniel thought as he continued to swipe and slash at any further encroachment from the tentacle creatures. He gathered his survival kit that was stowed in the pod and removed his personal emergency survival flare, a projectile device with a combination of strobing lights, hyper-colored fluorescent smoke, and a wide-spectrum electronic distress beacon. Revealing one's position was also fraught with risks, as you never knew exactly how civilized the population was on a world in the diaspora. But with only a couple of days of rations and the challenges of navigating a vast ocean, survival was dependent on rescue, and he knew full well that he was all alone. The crew of the FSS Duplicity Vice, surely all lost. It was over 16 hours later, as the early morning light of the planet's star kissed the horizon, when he saw it. Cresting over the edge of the world was what appeared to be an island, his first sighting of land since Splashdown. Yet this was no island. It was moving. Slowly, over the next several hours, the island seemed to float towards him until the details became apparent. Structures, windmills, cranes, and even sails adorned the surface of the floating island, while the whole of the structure gave off a rough metallic glint in the growing sunlight of the day as it approached. When it finally reached Nathaniel, the whole of the island dwarfed the capsule, an imposing construct of metal floating on an endless sea. Nathaniel looked up with awe at the island as faces appeared over the edge, some 30 feet above him. A mix of inquisitive expressions, young and old, peered over the edge and down at Nathaniel, seeking to gander at the strange spaceman seemingly lost at sea. The gathered crowd parted for a moment as a crane boom swung overhead, lowering a hook, which Nathaniel attached to the top of his capsule. Riding it up out of the water, Nathaniel watched as the inquisitive squid-like creatures clung to the edge of the flotation ring for a moment before falling back into the waters below. As the capsule cleared the edge of the island, Nathaniel could see that it housed hundreds of people, if not thousands, in a floating town. As it finally reached the deck, Nathaniel took his first step on the island before collapsing to the ground in a rough-seated position as a man approached. He was a jovial-looking man, middle-aged, wiry, fair skin, and red of face and hair. He wandered over and patted Nathaniel on the back as the starship mechanic remained seated, the exhaustion of his interstellar and aquatic ordeals finally getting the best of him. Nathaniel looked up at the man's smiling face. "You're not from around here, are you, son?" The man chuckled at the obviousness of his own statement. "Welcome to Ozovin." The deep bellowing of siren horns blared across the floating island of Sirius, alerting all to the impending danger. A frenetic apprehension instantly permeated all parts of the building and tower-adorned surface of the floton, its residents scurrying around like ants, working frantically to protect their nest from harm. Aaron felt the panic build within his wiry frame. He knew what the sirens signaled, the nature of the threat approaching them, and the impending risk of catastrophe it represented. It was a wave, a swell tidal wave, no doubt spotted by the Aquaterra constellation of orbitable monitoring satellites. But Aaron was acutely aware of the folly of indulging his panic, for any hesitation, any momentary lapse in judgment could spell doom for himself and his island. So, he got to work. This was far from his first swell, having spent all of his 21 years living on flotons, cruising the currents and the trade winds of Ozovin's global ocean. Typically, though, Sirius and the islands before that had been out of harm's way, or at the very least, had plenty of time to adjust their heading to move the island out of danger. But this time was different. An errant wave had emerged through the annual period of the swell with little warning, and, against the prevailing modeling from the Congressional Meteorological Office, or CMO, it was a freak wave, unpredictable and unforeseen, and they were the most dangerous. So, Aaron refocused on the task before him, securing the last of the storage crates with the flexi stabs, hoping that the island's precious cargo of raw metal, coral ores, and dried fish and kelp would remain safe during the wave event. As he finished, his storehouse partner and longtime friend, Maran, completed his own wing of the long shelves, wordlessly confirming a job well done with a thumbs up and a nervous yet determined smile. Aaron and Maran had met as children when their respective families had opted to assume positions as foundation members of a new island floton, Sirios. While Aaron's family had previously been on a floton during his early years, Sirios was Maran's first floton, so in those first days, Aaron had taken his young peer under his wing. And as they became fast mates, a friendship born from joint experiences and a shared sense of humor, Aaron knew he could trust Maran with his life, and had on several occasions during their childhood. If he said he had completed his task, then Aaron would never question him. The two friends briskly exited the main warehouse, securing the doors behind them with chain and padlock before turning and basking momentarily in the clear morning ocean breezes brushing against their faces. It would have been a wonderful feeling to savor if it had not been accompanied by their first glimpse of the swell wave. The typically flat cerulean-colored canvas of the ocean waters was broken by what first seemed like a distant set of rolling hills, elevated terrain wholly alien of Ozovin. Yet, only moments later, the details of the wave, breaking caps of white water, rising hundreds of feet into the air, became clear through the ocean haze. The wave was coming. Both Aaron and Maran rushed into the adjoining office of the warehouse and secured themselves to the fixed seating. As they tightened their harnesses, they both felt the island shift, lurching to port with much greater agility and momentum than the floton's normal set-at pace. It was clear that the pilots had activated the clutch of emergency anti-gravity field generators positioned around the outer, elevated edge of the roughly circular island, and were manipulating the fields to accelerate the floton away from the path of the wave. As the island accelerated, a sizable bow wave built, and soon, ocean water was cascading over the bow of the island and rushing across the surface like a flood. Yet, all flotons were designed to accommodate such an influx of water, whether it by errant wave or inclement weather, the excess draining away through the street grates and captured by water walls before it could permeate too deep into the island's urban layout. As the floton accelerated, now traveling perpendicular to the oncoming wave, Aaron shifted his gaze to the closing wall of water approaching them. It was already towering over island and approaching fast. The tidal stresses caused by the conjunction of Ozovin's two moons accelerating the wave to unnatural speeds. Only moments later, the island began to drift up onto the base of the wave itself, the floton turning to ride the tidal swell. "Woo woo!" Maran yelled exuberantly as the island rose up further and further on the face of the wave, before surfing it down and across thanks to the expert seakeeping of the island's master pilots. Aaron clung to his seat, tipped almost over onto the side for a few moments, unsecured knickknacks tumbling down and gently striking across his face. Yet it was only a few moments before the island's own velocity was reinforced by that of the swell, and soon, the floton accelerated away from the path of the wave. Sirios was safe and clear. With its reserves of tidal energy-charged mega battery spent, the island slowed and soon moved only at the behest of the sea and air. Aaron sighed with relief, and with his friend in tow, left the storehouse office to surveil the island outside. There was damage, to be sure. The pressures of the rapid acceleration and atypical orientation of the floton during its surfing caused two buildings to collapse and a crane tower structure to crumple. But they had survived. Aaron turned to Maran, a smile on his face and relief filling his heart. He went to speak, to comment with some witty remark to break the collective shocked silence. But before he could utter a word, a heavy blow landed in front of Aaron, propelling him back through the air with great force and causing his body to strike outer wall of the storehouse structure. Dazed and disoriented from the bludgeoning impact, Aaron could barely comprehend the devastation that was being wrought to the floton, as giant tentacles, several 100 feet long and 30 feet in diameter, laid waste to the surface of the island. And there, where his friend Maran had stood only moments earlier, was left a bloody stain of red ichor on the rough, rusted metal surface. Aaron looked on in horror, forced to sit prone against the storehouse wall with a broken back, as giant tentacles of some unseen gargantuan siphonophore squid rose high into the air before plummeting down atop the island. All his life, his hard work, his future was being taken from him, only moments after he survived the greatest threat the island had ever faced. It seemed so unfair. He could barely register his dread at his own impending demise before another of the tentacles was brought down upon the island by the Megacephalophore, this time crushing Aaron. Such is life on the open seas.